So Ruth.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons that we're here is to actually talk to each other about schools and Boston schools. Let me introduce what I remember, and then you talk about what you remember very shortly, and then we'll talk to each other about it. But I came to the Quincy Dickerman, which is was a Roxbury segregated school in the early 70s?
No, 60s.
60s.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh, I forgot that. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And during that time, I was a first grade teacher. And there's stories about that, but we can talk about that more later at some point if we have time. But my experience there was that I lived nearby in a segregated area in Roxbury. And I went to an all-white school, Regis. And I knew, and I'd been to predominantly white schools because my mom wanted me to get a good education, even though she sacrificed for it. So what happens is I find out, I know I wanted to be a teacher, and I find out that I have to find that place. I go to the Dickerman, which is, a hop, skip, and a jump from where I am, and go talk to the principal, whose wife, I find out, actually went to Regis College, too. So it was easy for him to say to me, oh, listen, you got that job. The way you do it is you just go down to the school committee and you'll see, and I can't remember who the school committee member was, and he told me that I had it. Oh, you did? Okay. I want to turn this off.
I turned the ringer off.
No, I want to turn this off, period. I get messages, and that's how I hear the messages, so I'm real sorry. It's off. Turn the ringer off? Okay, yeah, I turned the whole thing off, so I don't get any. So do I continue from here? Yeah. All right, so what happens is I go to the school committee member, and he looks at me. I was supposed to be there for an interview. He looks at me, and he says, your principal sent you. He told me he's giving you a job, so you got the job. The easiest way that anybody could get a job, especially since the majority of teachers in the Boston Public Schools were white. And it was never easy to get a job if you were black, if you were an African American in Boston. In fact, that was one of the things that the NAACP was upset about and picketing about. And the only way you did get it was to go to Boston Teachers College, and you could probably get in through there. So that was my entrance. I had a first grade class. I loved first grade. I loved the kids. And I walked in to see just nothing but white teachers. That was it. So I then stayed there for 3 years. And on the third year come these two, at that time we didn't call them radical. We called them more like informed white teachers. That was Ruth and that was Ellen. And they were my age. And everybody else was much older. And I wasn't quite part of the group of people who were there. And so when they came, we were able to start to talk to each other about real issues in the school. So, Ruth, so suppose you why don't you describe what went on with you when you came in? Okay. Because she's the teacher, by the way, that would tell me, she and Ellen, what the other teachers were saying about the kids. They would never tell me this. By the way, it was 99.9% black.
And I have just something to say about the one white child, too.
And
the way that child was treated.
Yeah,
I had graduated college, gone into publishing, had a meaningless job, read Death at an Early Age by Jonathan Kozol, and decided I needed to get into the schools and make some change. And you could get in as a substitute, hopefully as a permanent substitute, and I was eventually hired by the Dickerman under something called the compensatory program. I taught writing and illustrating stories, which is something I went on to do in other schools. But at the Dickerman, this was the most important. To start off, I subbed around Boston, and two things I should say. There was one school where I taught a special class, and I was so excited that there were students in this so-called special class who were so bright, really bright. And I was very naive, and I said to one of the teachers, "There are these children who are so bright." And she said, "It's only by comparison to the other children." Okay? Impenetrable. I taught at another school. This was in Roxbury, where I'm just a regular sub. We're in the hall. There are some kids, might have been fourth graders, lined up, and a teacher says to me, "Just like animals in the zoo." So that's how I came to the Dickerman.
So those were schools predominantly black,
These
right?
were black schools.
Yeah.
I can tell you the names, but I don't want to.
Okay.
So, yeah. So I come to the Dickerman, and I have this permanent job there. And I'm introduced around, and I'm so excited. Wonderful children. One class, a little boy, gives me a kiss. He's a second grader and hands me a picture. And the teacher says to me on the side, "Don't let them kiss you. They have germs." Okay, I'm getting the picture. The other first grader, and this is really important, I just found my notes onto what the teachers thought of these little children. This teacher said to me, "The trouble with you is you think everything they do is wonderful, and I don't." And it got worse. She and her husband, who was some kind of a big person in the Boston Public Schools, said, the answer is if we wave a wand and turn them white, that would be the solution.
No one ever said this to me, by the way.
No.
So I knew racism existed, but I could only find it out through you and Ellen. Yeah.
And I didn't crack. I just listened. And because I learned more and more that the more I argued, it just didn't sink in. So I have a collection of drawings and stories from the children as my proof of the kind of exceptional kids that were in this school who were so beaten down. What shocked me was that this first grade teacher told me that at the half a year mark, I came in the second semester in 1968. At the half-year mark, she had decided who she was going to hold back, and I was not to work with those kids. Yeah. And that's the whole point of my job, was to bring out all kinds of enrichment material to help the kids develop. No.
Can I just interrupt here? The program that you talked about was the Johnson program that came. More money came into poor areas, and you got compensatory education. So you were paid during that time. So I remember that when that happened, other teachers, including myself, would get $50 more a month, a paycheck or something like that. Something about $50 more, and you were supposed to stay late in class, stay for about an hour and work with other teachers. So there was an area where teachers got together, and every time I went down there, nobody was doing anything during that period of time. You're supposed to be planning new things. You're supposed to be working with kids. You're getting $50. And by the way, in the 60s, that was a lot of money to get. And the teachers, I remember one guy just smoking, and I would say, are we going to do something? And he would look at me and roll his eyes and go back to smoking again and reading his paper. So all during that time, the money that came out of the Johnson administration brought in teachers like Ruth and Ellen, and also gave extra money to teachers who taught in these schools at risk. But at least in my school, and I'm pretty sure in other schools, but I know in my school where I was, they took the money, they stayed, and then they ran. Is that the expression? You take the money and you run?
Yeah.
That's exactly what they did at that time. This is not to point to a bad individual. This is to point at a system that actually, as Ruth will continue to talk about, because that's how I would find what teachers said, a system that saw no value in these kids, but they can take money. They can say, yes, we'll work to help lift up our education system or our school, and we'll do more. And they did nothing, and they collected during that period of time. You had to stay after, so they would. They'd look at the watch and sit down, and they stay. Now, maybe there were other people in that school that might have been doing extra things. I don't know. I just know where many congregated and smoked cigarettes and did nothing. So,
Can I ask really quickly, what was it like hearing that people thought these were animals, these black kids, and then Lyda, from your perspective, I'm sure you didn't see this stuff.
no.
So what was it like from your perspective?
Well, you tell them what it was like from
mean,
hearing that.
It
How it
felt
felt.
horrific. I mean, when I finished teaching at the end of the year, and we'll tell you the things that happened, I was literally sick.
Yeah.
Because one thing I did learn was how little power we had with the legal system. Even, we'll tell you the stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when it came right down to it, the Globe had stepped in, and there was going to be some change.
Yeah, but there was a reason for that, and that's the story that they
That's
need to
what we're
hear.
going to tell
right?
you.
That's it.
Yeah.
Part of how I felt was after you hear what we're going to tell you about what happened to the first grade child, she was first grade, but she was 7 years old. After that, I didn't hear what Ruth is telling you because she couldn't tell me. You know, she and Ellen I heard it after when we reconnected years later.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I don't think you wanted me to hear that.
No, I know. I was afraid to even
yeah.
send you this letter now.
Yeah.
It's so, I mean, these
yeah.
notes, it's so upsetting.
That's the way she is. Ellen might have said it. Ellen
She
was
would have
our
told
third.
you.
Ellen might have said it, but
Yeah.
I don't have memory of people telling me these horrible things. But I knew. I didn't know the words. I knew. I could tell what they were doing. What it did for me is I joined the Boston education movement with Ruth Batson. I went to Metco first. She recruited me from there because we'll tell you the story, but she recruited me. And I went to Metco, and that's when I found out that there was in Roxbury a number of people for years who had been fighting on behalf of children and their parents for better schools. This wasn't even for desegregated schools. It was for equal educational opportunity, which was what was being said in D.C., equal educational opportunity, and what didn't happen in Boston.
Yeah.
So you want to start with the story about
I
Jacqueline?
want to, but I just want to add
Okay.
a couple of things,
And
because you won't
Marilyn.
believe that what they said to me, because
Right.
I didn't. The same first teacher said to me, they look like monkeys. She couldn't consider any of them beautiful.
Yeah.
It makes me ill now. I saw her, she would bang her little first graders in reading group on the head with the eraser of the pencil, and she said to Nina McCain at the Globe, we overheard it, she said, I tried to pound something into their heads, but it isn't easy.
Yeah.
She felt that, she said, they sold themselves to slavery. It's about self-respect.
Yeah.
Can you believe? And she said she's Italian, and when she was a child, she used to be taunted and hit, and yet she made it. Again, self-respect.
Now, can you believe this?
She's
this
teaching first graders.
And I was teaching first graders, so she and I were
Yeah.
opposite each other. And I was there, but I wasn't there. I mean, I had no nobody to bond with, nor did I want these people to bond with. And so that's why I was so happy to find these young people who were, they didn't call them radical in those days, but they were more radical than not at that time. But the story that's important, and I think also we need to talk about that, is a particular day, and Ruth has another one that I really think needs to be on record too.
Yeah, too.
About Maryland. But Friday would be the day that, well, first of all, every day at 3:00 everybody left real quick, except for some teachers who decided to stay after and to do certain work in their rooms. But most of the people just emptied out of that school. Most of the teachers emptied out of that school. Ruth and Ellen and I didn't. But this one Friday, Ruth and Ellen came into my classroom and said, I think it might have been you, but said, I want you to see this teacher's desk, what she's doing with her students. So
Those are the white dolls.
that's what. Well, let me tell that story. So because that's why I want you to really go on to it. One of the things that I did in writing my dissertation is I centered this because this tells you about the school in and of itself. Ruth says, come in, you've got to see what this teacher is doing. So I remember walking in, and Ruth also needs to talk about her memories and coming in. You go in and you have a classroom. My first classroom as a young woman in my 20s had 45 kids in it, 45 to 50 children, first graders in it. By this time, because of that money coming in, we were probably down now to about 30. These were Boston had, black part of Boston had very, very old schools, very old schools. So we go into her room, and in this room, you can see all the chairs of the kids, and there had to have been about 40 in her room, 30 to 40 in her room. And they're facing her desk, and her desk is in the front. And in the front, when you walk in, you see these dolls. She'd love to have kids do nothing but art, paint, do whatever it was. She liked to teach something, but I don't know what it was. But she loved to do this. There are these white China-like dolls. And I remember all of their faces were white, except the kids had started painting. That's what she was teaching, painting. So the kids had started painting stuff. And she's showing me, she's saying, look what this woman does. You know, and all you could do is picture these chairs, these 40 chairs. That was my vision. These 35, 40 chairs facing these white dolls. Nothing but white dolls. All black classroom. And these white dolls that they're painting, and they're painting their faces white and with colors and all kinds of other stuff. And that's what I'm fixed on when Ellen goes into the cloak closet. Ellen is our third person who's sadly not with us. She goes into the cloak closet and she says, look what I found. And out comes Jackie, a 7-year-old black kid that this teacher who is known for taping mouths, putting kids in closets, but she wasn't the only one. People punished kids by putting them in closets. And she forgot. What she says is she literally forgot that she left them in the closet. This was a Friday. Everybody, kids, adults, everybody, but the three of us and the janitor was there. I didn't know the janitor was there until a paper came out and the janitor said, well, I was here, and if I found her, I would have taken her to her mother or made sure her mother knew about it. That was the janitor. But other than that, that was what it is. So if you want to add anything onto it, that was my memory of going in that class after you said, I got to show you this, Lyda. And I'm looking at these dolls, and I'm looking at these desks, and I'm looking at imagining these black kids looking at these white dolls and painting these white dolls.
Yeah.
So you have memories of that? By the way, we took her to Ellen did she find her? Did we find her? Anyway,
Yeah.
the parent found her, and we kept her actually, and the parent found her, and took her home. And I remember she said this to me. She said, "What do I do?" She said this to us.
Yeah.
And she said, "What do I do?" And I remember saying, "Go to the NAACP." And that's exactly what she did. And the next thing you know, that's why I was saying that's how the reporter came, because it was Dexter Ure. And he was a black reporter at the Globe. The next day we come in, at least I come in, I don't know whether you were there at that time, but I know I came in, and he's at the top of the stairs, and he says, I'm going to write about this because we need to add this to the Garrity decision and what's going on in this school system. It wasn't a Garrity decision at that time, by the way. It was what was going to go to the court. So it wasn't 74. And we need to add this to them. So she had gone and called the NAACP, and apparently word went around, and Dexter comes to say, I want the story, and I'll get you another job. And if you get fired and blah, blah, blah. So that's how we ended up in the Boston Globe. And
Yes.
through Nina McCain and him.
I got a note saying the Boston Globe is going to blow the whole thing open.
Yeah, that was Dexter. Dexter Ure was his name. He was great. But he was also lived in Roxbury, was a black reporter, was probably one of the only black reporters at that time, and interested because nobody else was there.
And he
And
interviewed us.
Well, tell it like it is. His column was
There will be
tell it
a
out.
copy in the archives of the interviews with Lyda and me and
A number of teachers there.
there
Ellen.
were 5 of us who
Yeah.
were interviewed at the Phillips Brooks School and the Dickerman.
Right.
And
About the what went on
right, you take
generally.
I'm going to.
Oh, they said they're going to.
Ruth, can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
You said you were able to keep a straight face when these
yeah.
racists were saying all these bad things. How were you able to do that? And did you also feel like a guilt because you were kind of
No, I came with a purpose. I didn't know. That's what I wanted. I wanted to hear it from myself and pass it on. Passing it on is very difficult. When this story broke, a couple of things happened. One, I was interviewed by an extremely prominent Boston newscaster, whose name
Nina? Who? Nina McCain?
John Hennessy.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Okay. He interviewed me for the Noon News when this story broke about the little girl in the closet. And before he spoke to me, before he put the microphone under my mouth, he said, "You don't really believe all this business about the racism and the teachers. Can you imagine?" I couldn't imagine. That's when we knew the enemy camp was larger than we could even figure. It was so alarming.
See how these paths went? When we all left, she's in a path that, because I remember that you and Ellen went with Jonathan Kozol and in those areas, and you were organizing somehow with some groups.
The Gould Shaw House.
Right.
There
Some
was
groups.
an organization of black and white teachers.
Right.
It was a real beginning.
Right.
And then Martin Luther King was killed.
Right.
And very strategic, I realized,
right.
because he was bringing people together, and we were starting to get some power.
Right.
But when that happened, the whole coalition just broke apart. It was just too devastating for the community, and that's when the black community took over.
Well, they'd been around since 19th century, early 19th century through, trying to get equality. It was called equality in schools. Equal educational opportunity came after that, but they were looking for good schools. So that small black community went on and on and on. And because when you have children, and I understand it now because I do, you want them to have better than what you had. And schools are the way to do it. And if you don't have money for private schools, you look towards Catholic schools or you look towards public schools. Most people can't afford even Catholic schools, so they go to public schools. And what they expect with their kids, with their children, is that they're going to get some kind of an education. What you don't know that's happening is education means you're going to learn to read, you're going to learn to write. I don't even think people were thinking about learning how to think, but just the basics of what you get in schools. But what they didn't understand was that they were getting this horrible, racist idea of who they were, that they were worth little to nothing. And it took their parents and a community that surrounded them to show them, yes, you are worth something. We are uniting, and we are going to get you what we can based on law. Based on law and based on our love for you as kids. And that's exactly how that went on. So when you had folks like Ruth and Ellen and others organizing, Jonathan Kozol was actually a very important part of this and writing that book, although there had been a book before that about being in the Boston Public Schools. It opened it up to everybody, even those who doubted it, but it sure did open up the minds of many who, like you, younger too, a lot younger, although I do know a woman who drove buses who sent her kids to schools in Roxbury, where who came from South Boston, where a lot of the people from South Boston just sent their kids to Catholic schools or they moved. So there were people who could, white people who could, because of knowing what is right and wrong, what their values were. But then there were too many who did not.
This is something that I should tell you. Part of my introduction to the school was a second grade teacher who, of course, took me, under her wing and sat me down with her seating chart. And you won't believe, under each child's name was an IQ, 65, 70, all the way down. Of course, from my experience working with them, that was just baloney. But she said, what am I supposed to do with a class like this? And when I was in every classroom every day, first and second grade, doing writing and telling stories and illustrating, and a little girl in the back of the room gave a wonderful answer to something. And the teacher said, how did you get that out of her? So you see what we were up against. And the other thing was that when this happened with the little girl left in the closet and the Globe, we have all these articles that we're going to copy for you, that there was no way, I don't know how to phrase it, the Globe was hot on it until their lawyer spoke to them and said, are you really going to believe these young women, girls, they probably said, versus these experienced teachers? Yeah. And we were out of it. We used to meet after school, was it at Metco? Remember we used to meet and talk, and Nina McCain came, and she would, once she even called this first grade teacher, and we listened to her as the teacher gave these racist remarks, trying to explain how she wasn't racist. Yeah, Nina McCain did a great job, but in the end, the lawyers squashed it.
You're talking about the Globe lawyers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nina
Boston.
McCain was a
Boston Globe. So is Dexter.
Writer,
was.
And she was trying to do something. And what I learned as a young white teacher working with black teachers, that only the lawyers had a voice. And I went to graduate school and taught my kids things. I taught freshman English, and I was getting a master's in English Lit. And I taught Amiri Baraka, I taught The Dutchman, I taught Soul on Ice. I figured I can change minds. And And one more thing about the busing and the problems. I had a black student in one of my freshman class who said, but you know what? This is the other joke of it, that she was sent from her black neighborhood that had a good school to a white neighborhood in South Boston where the biggest thing people wanted to become was a hairdresser.
Yeah.
There needs to be a much more intelligent way of bringing decent education.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I was tapping.
No, no worries.
Oh, yeah. We have to tell about Maryland. They won't
Well,
believe.
yeah, you can tell that story. I don't remember it. You
Okay,
told me
so
that.
Let's talk about
Yeah.
why you all being ignored and being looked over might have delayed desegregation for multiple years.
No, I don't understand that question. No, I don't. Who?
She was just saying they did not put out the report, it sounds like.
No, they did. It all was in the Globe.
Yeah. So
They just wouldn't. They fired.
she's talking about the Globe.
I'm talking about the Globe.
Yeah, the paper itself.
Because
but,
they said they were going to. We thought this was the beginning.
Yeah. But there was a lot of life. So that's a small part of it, because once the Dickerman became part of this larger group of parents and teachers and community activists who where kids were being discriminated against. So around right before the decision, so around the early 1970s, you had a lot of activity. You had a lot of activity from the black community. And Ruth Batson, who many people have written about and have interviewed her, really took the lead, but it was part of the NAACP's education committee, and she was in charge of it. And it was another person, Paul Parks, and a number of people that did that. So this thing started to get larger and larger while more things were being exposed. That was one of the reasons why Dexter came. He came because people were trying to expose. Lots of parents in different schools were complaining. Lots of people in different schools had organized. Lots of parents had walked their kids. It was Operation Exodus, which was run by a black woman and the parents who bust their kids out of a black school into South Boston, just because South Boston had seats and black kids were sitting on top of each other with 45 in a room. They bust them to South Boston. What did they do the next day? They bust them, by the way, surprisingly, they weren't ready for that. And they had open enrollment. So that's how they did it. They were they were using open enrollment to seat these kids. The principal of that school took all the seats out, unscrewed them, and took all the seats out except for the kids that were there. This was what you fought against, and this is what parents fought against. So this was so that black kids couldn't go to that school, that particular school. So this is what was being fought against, and this is why it went to the courts. It was a violation, and it went to the courts. People blame Judge Garrity. I have no idea why they blame Judge Garrity, and the only people I know that blame Judge Garrity are those who opposed desegregation. Some black people might not have wanted their kids to be bused any place, and you can understand that. I wouldn't want my kid to be on a bus, but I would want my kid to be on a bus if it meant they were going to get the kind of education that was necessary for them to become become a citizen, a thinking and knowing citizen. And that's what you're going to find out all across the country. Parents took chances to go to these places in order to do that. So with Boston, these parents and these community activists did everything they could possibly do. Even though Ruth led this and Paul Parks also led this, you had every major, I don't know whether you remember, you probably should, Mel King as a leader. You had every major leader in Boston who was part of this movement to slice through these schools to make them better. And they weren't, one of the people I interviewed at one point said, we didn't want our kids to be going to these schools in South Boston because we wanted them to sit next to these white kids that didn't like them. We wanted them to go to these schools because that's where everything was. The books, the better books, the places that they saw, the books that they read. One last thing. When I was a first grade teacher and I had to give what was called reading readiness test, all of the teachers in the black area got the used books and tests from white areas, what they didn't use. So I'm there for the first time, this little kid that loves kids and wants to be here and wants to teach first grade. It was a test that was 1943. 1943. It was a test for 1943. And these kids had to answer questions that only people who lived in 1943 knew. This first graders. So there were pictures of things the kids didn't even know what they were because they didn't live there. So that's literally the way I want to end it. No one wanted integration. No one wanted buses. All they wanted was a decent education for their children. That's all they wanted. And they couldn't get it in Boston at that time. I don't know how it's going now, but I do know at that time they did not get it in Boston. And they would do anything to get it.
Lyda, I think we should tell the Maryland story, too.
I think they said it's only, you're finished,
Quickly.
right? Oh,
This is really important.
okay.
Lyda had a student in her class named Marilyn, who's a very passionate, outspoken,
She talked
out
a
of
lot.
control.
She talked a lot.
Cried a lot too. She could cry.
Yeah, she talked a lot.
But
she was
we
a kid.
loved her.
She was a doesn't
was full
matter.
of passion.
She was
Yeah.
a first grade child.
Now-
They talk a lot. That's what first grade. That's what they do. They do that. So go on.
But she had some problems, and we wanted to do what would happen in any normal school. We called in. We wanted to have her mother come in and see if we could work with
Yeah.
how she could help.
Yeah.
And this is what happened. How the vice principal got involved, I don't know. He called us to the office, Lyda, me, Marilyn's mother, very tall woman, and all of a sudden, Boston used rattans, whipping sticks, and he gives it to the mother, and I don't know what he said to her, but she started hitting Marilyn. Now, she didn't want to. She was sobbing her eyes out. Marilyn was crying. Marilyn was grabbing her mother under her skirt, and the mother hitting and hitting. And Lyda and I stood there. We hadn't even imagined such a thing. Stony-faced, but that was really, it was as bad as they said it was. Imagine that happening in a white suburban school somewhere where the teacher makes the mother beat her kid.
Yeah. I want to say one thing about this. It must have been terrible because I have no memory of it.
I can't believe that.
She tells
We
me that
stood
story. I
there
have no
together.
memory of. No,
Yeah.
seriously. For me
Yeah.
to forget this, I don't know why. Other than it must have hit me really bad. I can remember a lot that went on in schools, but I have no memory of this. And she tells me the story.
And I have no memory of what happened after.
Yeah.
Did Marilyn go home?
I don't. Well,
Did she
that's
come back
it.
to the classroom?
But the actual beating of a child is so traumatic that I cannot remember it. That was my point. I'm glad you did remember it.
It's
She has with her art, she's made a beautiful.
This. So you get an
remembrance of
idea of what
this.
it felt like. It's just
She
an
did that.
abstract picture of a mother and a child. That mother did not want to hit her child.
Yeah. No, of course
That was standard procedure at the school. And
this is because it was 99% black, and there was one white kid that she knows, and I don't remember.
the teacher kept that white child isolated in the front of the room. She said, what kind of a mother would send her white child to school in this neighborhood? She must be a prostitute or something. And picked on that kid, said he was dirty. And I had them do a drawing collage of what their special private place would be like from a book called Evan's Corner. And this little boy wrote, I don't want a private place, I'm lonely. So they not only hated the black children, but they hated a white family that would put their child into school in that neighborhood.
And this was low income. It was a very low income neighborhood.
And this was second grade. Yeah. So.
Yeah. That's the story. This thing was, when she tells this story about Maryland, it gets to me. But
Can I ask you one last thing?
Yeah.
We only have a minute left.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about your legacy, your role,
Oh.
and what led up to Garrity?
Yeah. Well, mine is being part of that movement. The person that I mentioned, who is like my second mother, was Ruth Batson. She wasn't at that time. I knew her, and she called me right after this happened, and she said I'd been threatened by the vice principal. He'd called my house and called me at home and told me, said to me, I don't know why you're doing this. Your people have gone to our schools, and all kinds of remarks that were just totally inappropriate. Again, I was I was little and young. And so he said to me, it was in my third year, so that's when you would get permanent position. And I said, I don't know what I said, other than my mom was sitting there and she said, don't worry. Shortly after that, unbeknownst to her, Ruth Batson calls me, and Ruth Batson is the person in charge of education and, NAACP. And I testified before MCAD, and she was one of the co-chairs, she and Father Dryden. And I testified about what went on at that time because they wanted to know. So she calls me and she says, would you like a job? I'm starting a new program. It was called Medco. And I went with her, and then I was with her for 40 years. So that's what got me away from here into becoming an activist, learning from her. And her mind was so clear. Up until then, things were just, running around in my head, trying to figure out what's going on. I hadn't been... I did not understand racism until I started at the Dickerman. And then I learned how to confront it when Ruth called me and asked me to work with her, and I was with her for 40 years until she died. So that was she and my mother were my two mentors, so to speak. And that's how I grew up. That's when I grew up. That's how I grew up.
And then you introduced me to Mary Harvey in Violence Transformed, a political arts group, and I've been making sculptures of women bearing witness with their mouths open and gesturing and telling, voices for the voiceless is what I call them, and that's been the whole force of my life. Starting with
that's it.
With Marilyn.
That's it. She contacted me one day with a card when she first started. I hadn't seen her in years, 20 years. And she was someplace, and she sent me a card, and we've been together again. We reunited again. So that's how she and I are together as friends.
I think one other thing, too, is not only, of the busing, but the Boston schools need to be so fixed.
So
I wanted to close them all.
Stop using busing. It is desegregation. That bus is nothing but transportation.
Oh, jeez.
Just talk about desegregation, because that's the real issue. The real issue is segregation versus desegregation.
And ignorant.
And it isn't a bus. By the way, that's how kids in the South, white kids in the South, went to school. When we look at history, they went to school on buses. right, right past black kids who walked to schools longer than their bus ride. So busing, this notion of busing, and it becomes this word that is so meaningless when you think about what really went on, and it wasn't a bus. That's blaming Judge Garrity. That's what busing is. It's keeping all of the interest in Judge Garrity. It's saying, blame him. He's the one that got busing, without saying what came before busing. But there was by the way, people were going to school on buses before busing. So that's part of what, that's part of what just bugs me. That's why I asked you what you were going to talk about, because if you had said busing, I would have said, I don't think so.